Today, we're taking a look at the new tactics coming out of the war in Ukraine, from how Ukraine is conducting their defense, how Russia is carrying out their attacks, and how the two sides are essentially playing a game of drone innovation cat and mouse. Also, some pretty wild details in the history of the Ukrainian drone boat program, or USV, that just were made public a couple days ago. Now, today's assessment is largely going to be taken from Michael Kofman, a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment. Incredible resource, very, very smart individual. He runs the Russian Contingency Podcast on War on the Rocks. I'll link everything I can in the description below to his work. Worth following wherever you can find him. But I do want to be clear, this is an assessment by Michael Kofman that I'll be reading through and then adding context as we go. Mr. Kofman says, quote, "An update on the war following a recent trip. As Russian offensive pressure mounts, the front is not at risk of collapse, though salients have formed. More concerning is that Russian improvements in drone employment have reduced Ukraine's advantages. In 2024, drones became responsible for most day-to-day casualties at the front, attriting Russian forces at 0 to 15 kilometers and serving as the main force multiplier for Ukraine. This enabled a low-density defending force to hold the 1,200-kilometer front line, establishing defeat and denial zones. Russian casualties increased relative to terrain being gained. However, it was unclear whether drones would be enough to stabilize the front line, given Ukraine's manpower challenge, Russia's ability to replace losses, and if Russian forces could adapt to counter this approach." Now, as we get into the movements on the battlefield and some areas, specific areas that Kaufman calls out, I'm going to pull up Deep State map here for a reference. But a couple key components there. Really what Kaufman is getting at is the drone wall program, Army of Drones program that Ukraine has been rolling out now for some time. And it's created essentially a dead zone near the front, where Russian forces are incredibly vulnerable as they try to traverse some of that area under constant ISR, constant surveillance, being hit by drones, usually long before they're in direct fire range of Ukrainian defenders. The question that Kaufman appropriately raises there is, would that be enough to actually hold the front lines long term? And in some cases, yes. In other cases, it appears that Russia is able to find some ways through, and we're going to get into how they're doing that here in just a moment. Now, looking at Kaufman's battlefield assessment here, he says the situation in Sumy has stabilized. We'll pull in to Sumy up here in the north. Again, the red is territory taken by Russia in Ukraine. The blue is a couple counterattacks carried out by Ukraine in recent weeks. He says the situation in Sumy has stabilized after Ukraine deployed air assault units there to counter the Russian advance, holding it to a small buffer of 200 square kilometers. Russian forces make slow progress by Kupiansk, east of the Oskil River, but continue inching forward. It's an area a little here further to the southeast that's not getting a lot of attention. But to stay up here with Sumy real quick, as soon as Russian forces began moving in, the concern was that they would push all the way to the city of Sumy. The secondary concern is that they would get within artillery range. So it's one thing to hit the city here with drones that can, of course, be incredibly effective and lethal. But once it's in especially cannon, but at least rocket artillery range, Russian forces would be able to regularly hammer the city center and eventually force a withdrawal of the citizens from that area, and kind of add some pressure to the Ukrainian defenders up here at the line. Additional pressure above and beyond what they're already feeling. So the stopping of Russian forces in this area is notable to a relatively small buffer zone. He says the Russian military continues to, move here, the immediate problem is the near envelopment of Pokrovsk. So we'll zoom back out, head south to a pocket that we've talked about in just about every video for a few weeks now, Pokrovsk right here. He says the immediate problem is the near envelopment of Pokrovsk. The pocket formed around Konstantinivka, just a little bit here. I'm going to zoom out so we can see that a little better. So Pokrovsk here on the left, Konstantinivka up here on the right or the northeast. And the fighting near the Dnipro-Donetsk border. Russian units are also trying to stretch Ukrainian manpower with attempts to push in Zaporizhia along the Dnipro River. Again, something we talked about yesterday when getting into some of these battlefield updates. This area right down here is starting to see some Russian advances near Plavny. So those three areas are kind of the focus of Russian attacks. We've talked about that for quite a while. It's not a secret, but something that Kaufman highlights here as well. He says the Russian military continues to underperform given their overall advantage in manpower and material. It is remarkable that Ukraine has held Pokrovsk and Chasiv Yar this long, but the situation has worsened and probably will further before Russian offensives stall. Yesterday, we talked about the news coming out of Chasiv Yar, where Russia said, we took this territory, and showed some videos of flag raisings. Ukraine pretty shortly thereafter said, what on earth are you talking about? It also released some photos and images or videos of their guys in the areas that Russia said they've taken. Russia doubled down on that today, with Vladimir Putin actually earlier today specifically mentioning Chasiv Yar, saying, yeah, we have taken that. Russian forces are in control of that area. Nonetheless, Kaufman's point here is not whether or not Chasiv Yar fell, but the fact that each one of these areas where Russia is pushing is taking a long, long time. But it's not all criticism of the Russian military here. Kaufman does push back on Ukraine, where he says the main culprit is the policy within Ukraine to hold on to every meter, even when in near envelopment or in disadvantageous terrain. Rather than trading space for attrition or conducting a mobile defense, Ukrainian commanders are forced to try to hold onto untenable positions. And this is something that we should be used to now. It's unfortunate, but we saw that in Bakhmut. We saw that in Marinka. We saw that in Avdiivka. Multiple areas. We saw that in Kursk recently, right? Relatively early on in that fight, it became clear that Russian forces were advancing, and the little bulge that Ukraine had established in Russian territory was untenable. Just very, very difficult situation to hold on to. And in a perfect world, there likely would have been a withdrawal, an orderly withdrawal earlier on. But as the Ukrainian commanders in charge of that sector at the time decided to wait and wait and wait, it resulted in not only the loss of quite a few men being killed and captured in that, but also the loss of a lot of equipment that was left behind that otherwise likely could have been moved out and repositioned at another sector. So Kaufman, I've heard him a couple different times kind of hammer on that point that these salients, yes, they're defendable right now. They are inflicting heavy losses on the Russian soldiers, but at some point there has to be that decision of time to move back to the next area where you can maintain the largest still intact force possible. Now, in talking about some of the breakthroughs here, yesterday we mentioned some Russian mill bloggers that were very excited about Chasiv Yar, suggesting, hey, next up, Kramatorsk, Sloviansk. And, that's not really in the cards, and Kaufman hits on that as well. He says Russian tactics do not lend themselves to attaining operationally significant breakthroughs, but given the character of the fight, territory changing hands is a lagging indicator for what's happening. Consequently, gradually then suddenly transitions are possible. And that is something that I think we've become a little numb to, unfortunately, and it's not good. But just because Ukrainian forces have been able to hold for long periods of time in Pokrovsk and just outside of Toretsk now, up near Sumy and elsewhere along the front, does not mean that that is going to be the situation indefinitely. Things change, and sometimes it's just a matter of troops being worn down. The individual soldiers getting exhausted being near the front. We're going to talk in a minute here in the next portion about defensive positions and how some of these Ukrainian soldiers are holding their position for 90 plus days. You're not the same 90 days into a fight as you are the first day when you get there. And that's the kind of thing where over time, just because it has held in the past, is no guarantee of future success. It's something to keep in mind here. Now, turning to some of the defensive positions here outlined by Kaufman and how Ukraine is defending their territory, he says the current dynamic is one of lines held by what are often three-man positions with large gaps in between. These are neither firing positions or observation posts. They form a porous line in which infantry are often told not to expose themselves unless absolutely necessary. Although there is great work done in detailing Ukrainian fortifications, most of the observed positions are constructed in the open and will never be occupied by units. They are easily targeted and destroyed. Ukraine lacks infantry to man most of them in the first place. He says, and I got to get through all of this to add some context here because each paragraph I think is as meaningful or more than the last. He says, this is not a war of trenches. It's a war of individual fighting positions, fortified and well-masked units in tree lines, buildings, basements, or in dense forests. Occupying fortifications in the open is usually considered suicidal by troops. Since pervasive ISR and fires impose a degree of fire control over forward positions, it is not possible to move large numbers of troops forward, sustain, or rotate them. Now some are on the line for 90 plus days, and it often takes several days to reach a position on foot. So there's a lot to unpack there, but I think the most important aspect that he's driving home is, although this has been a relatively positional war, an attritional focused war, and it's so easy to draw comparisons to World War I because that's largely what we saw in that conflict. And the minute Russians and Ukrainians started digging into the ground, it was, hey, there we go, trench warfare. Now we have something to compare it to. But he makes the point that there are not continuous trenches running all along the front. That's not what's being defended. Again, the scenes out of 1917 or All Quiet on the Western Front where you see regiments, battalions, divisions getting up out of their trench line at the same time and charging across open terrain does not exist in this war. And we'll get into that with some of the Russian attack tactics here in a moment. But it's largely these small outposts. He says they're not observation posts. You don't really need them when you have drones overhead. But essentially, you don't want to call them a last line of defense, but actually some personnel there that can inflict direct fire or conduct direct fire engagements as needed if the Russian forces enter that sector. But at the same time, they have to remain hidden because as soon as they're exposed or it's clear that that's where a Ukrainian defensive position is, they're going to be hammered by Russian air power and drones. One other aspect here, talking about how there's a lot more positions right now than are going to be manned. There's a couple different reasons for that. One, yes, he hits on it, is the manpower shortage, or they just don't have enough people to fully man every one of these positions, but also that some of these fortifications in the open are just, as he says, suicidal. So you have to think that some of these positions further and further back from the front have been, when were they built? A year ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago? Tactics were very, very different at that point. So in a lot of cases, when you see an open trench line dug or fighting positions dug through an open field, that might have worked in 2022, maybe even parts of 2023 if there was enough cover from Russian artillery. It won't work today. So those positions are still there. They're just not likely to be used as Ukraine continues to shift around the battlefield. Now, turning to some of the Russian attack tactics that we're seeing here, he says Russian attacks are sometimes in 4 to 6 man groups, but in many cases have decreased to numerous 2 to 3 man sections trying to penetrate in between Ukrainian positions. Russian infantry seek to advance as far as possible past Ukraine's initial line and entrench there. Although many may be lost, some get through and entrench awaiting reinforcements. Much the same can be said of motorcycle and buggy assaults, trying to bypass initial lines and enter the rear. Most fail, but not all, leading to small tactical advances. And that is the nature of what we've seen when you're looking at maps and trying to get an idea of how the battlefield is changing day to day, even week to week. That's what we're seeing. Small little advances here or there. I think it was last week we played a video of Russian forces raising a flag in an area in the southern portion of the country. Let me see if I can recall where that was. I think it was to the southwest of Pokrovsk. Somewhere in here, I believe. No, further southwest, excuse me. I think it was down in this area here. Nonetheless, there was Dashny. I want to say it was in Dashny. And the video was, I think, 4 total Russian soldiers moving through, and it looked like they were trying to clear some trenches, but there was nobody in those trenches. Again, not every trench line is manned by Ukrainian soldiers. And they cleared some of that area out, and next thing you know, they're waving a flag. And we were talking about it. Like, does that mean they've secured the area when there's 3 or 4 Russians with a flag in a village? It's not the same image of, again, go back to World War II, and you see armored divisions rolling through towns, and you say, well, now that one is secured. That town is liberated. Does it hold up when it's 2 or 3 guys that found a little bit of a gap in the line, ran through, held up a flag? Do they now control it? And that's part of the reason we are seeing multiple areas along the front regularly contested, where you see one map says that Russia advanced, another map says no, they didn't, and then you have to wait days or even weeks to get a clear understanding of what actually happened. Kaufman continues talking about mechanized assaults. He says these are seen now much less frequently, in part because Russian forces are trying to conserve equipment, but also because Ukraine has long optimized for defeating traditional mechanized attacks, which invariably fail with high vehicle losses. And just a couple days ago, I think I saw my first video in a long time of multiple Russian armored vehicles attempting an assault at the same time, and that video showed them all getting blown up. So we're just not seeing a lot of that as of late. Not often dismounted infantry, but a lot of the buggy assaults, or even kind of turtle tanks, onesies and twosies, kind of flying towards the front. Shifting over to the drone war here and the back and forth on that front, he says Ukraine's unmanned systems forces are now led by Robert Brovdy, head of MIDAR, and is launching plans that will better integrate and systemize drone employment. These hold promise as Ukrainian drone employment needs to evolve and stay ahead. One area where Ukraine remains clearly ahead of Russian forces is UGV employment, unmanned ground vehicles, for logistics and medevac. This is more about establishing capable mesh networks to enable UGVs use across terrain, and the cost of the communications can easily equal that of the platform. And I think it was last month or the month prior, we did some fundraising and actually picked up some UGVs for a couple different Ukrainian units, and that's what they were talking about, is using them for logistical and medevac purposes. We're seeing this a little bit with Russia, and something to keep in mind with the back and forth in this drone war is, generally speaking, neither side is ever too far in front or behind the other. So we are seeing UGVs starting to be utilized by Russia. A lot of the Russian videos at this point still shows them trying to incorporate direct fire mechanisms, machine guns and the like on the drones. A little bit of that coming out of Ukraine at this point. Just in the last couple weeks, I've started to see more Russian units utilize these for logistics purposes. I have not yet seen Russian UGVs used for medevac. That does seem to be a bit of a priority on the Ukrainian side. Maybe I haven't seen those videos, but nonetheless, as it sits today, UGV usage, which is generally non-lethal, is probably the best way to put it, is the lead right now is certainly with Ukraine. They say, however, Ukraine is also seeking to close the gap in strike munitions that cover the 30 to 100 kilometer range and strike systems for operational depths of 300 plus kilometers that are much more effective than cheap light drones, as well as ground-launched cruise missiles and short-range ballistic missiles. We've seen a little bit of that in recent months where Ukraine is able to carry out deep strikes inside of Russia. One of the challenges there, originally, I think everybody would have thought the challenge was getting through Russian air defense. Clearly, Ukraine has found a way to do that and penetrate into 300, 400, 500 kilometers deep inside of Russian territory. One of the challenges we're seeing, there was a strike on a factory just last week where, yes, the drone got through. Yes, the drone hit the factory, but it was a relatively small payload, and the factory probably was operational later that same day. So it's kind of a combination of being able to evade Russian air defenses with at range, but also with a payload capable of employing or enacting significant damage on the Russian targets. That's still in the works in a lot of ways. On the Russian side of the drone tactics, he says the Russian military began deploying its own offensive line of drones and improving how it employs drone units. Russian Rubicon drone units have spread to every Russian grouping of troops and are the most spoken of challenge across the front. Rubicon formations focus on severing logistics with fiber optic drones, operating 20 to 25 kilometers behind the front line, destroying drone positions and intercepting Ukrainian drones, the winged ISR and heavy quadcopters or Baba Yaga vampire-style drones. He says, in general, Russian drone units have become better organized. This does not mean that Ukraine has lost its edge in drone employment, but the advantage has narrowed. Russian forces continue to adapt, and Ukraine must find ways to stay ahead. And something worth keeping in mind here is that you really are talking about Ukraine on the defense with Russia on the offense, and drones are going to be used in different capacities. So a lot of the Ukrainian hunting, to be blunt, is using these drones in a defensive capacity, waiting for Russian forces to poke their head above ground and then get absolutely hammered by multiple drone units. It's a little bit different on the Russian side where they're trying to advance. So they're using a lot of these fiber optic drones, and we're seeing this down around Pokrovsk, where instead of and they're, not to downplay the use of FPVs and bombers at the front because those are constant all day, every day, but there's a lot more kind of tactically going after logistics routes to cut off and encircle Ukrainian forces. So we're seeing a bit of a different use. between the two sides. On that note, we are starting to see more and more, this was not in the Kaufman assessment, but something I wanted to bring up, more and more use of, or the tactic of kind of ambushing vehicles. So I've got a clip here that just came out earlier today showing Russian drones ambushing Ukrainian vehicles. So what they're doing is they're setting down on a road. It saves some battery, but more importantly, it makes the drones harder to detect as the vehicles are driving by. Again, think about in one of these vehicles, you got to be looking for threats in a lot of different directions. They very well are likely looking for landmines on the road, but drones overhead, right? You're looking in the sky all around for drones and listening for drones. When a drone is on the road or set just off the side, like we're seeing in this video, it can wait for a vehicle to pass by, pop up, and carry out a strike. This is becoming more and more common. We're seeing a lot of these ambush-style attacks take place in both directions. The last section here from Kaufman is talking about Russian long-range fires, where he says there's been an exponential increase in Russian drone and missile strikes against Ukrainian infrastructure. However, Ukraine is rapidly scaling up the use of drone-based interceptors paired with light radars. It will take time to expand production, upgrade mobile air defense, and build out a defensive line of air defense units, but the technical solution to the Shahed-Garan imitator drone saturation problem exists and is a matter of resourcing its deployment. Who knows? That's a big gap to fill. And we've talked about this regularly, where you have the high-end air defense systems that are expensive and very capable, and there's not a lot of them. Think Patriot. You technically could use those against Shaheds, but you don't want to do it for very long because you're going to run out of those interceptors. Better used against aircraft and missiles. Then on the other end, you've got very cheap systems, surface air fire, right? 50 cal machine guns, or even lighter, shooting down some of these drones. Very, very inexpensive, but not all that effective, and can be difficult to accomplish the task at times. That middle ground of finding interceptors that are cheap, numerable, and effective has been a major challenge in this war. If Ukraine actually has that solution right now, maybe this is an area that the United States or even Europe could help step into. And there's a lot of production facilities outside of Ukraine that maybe we could assist them in resourcing its development and production. Now, that's the end of the Kaufman piece. Again, linked in the description below, worth reading start to finish. I pulled out what I thought were the interesting tidbits, but I did want to highlight an article in Naval News put together by H I Sutton a couple days ago, giving the first background, I think, of the Ukrainian Magura drones. These are the unmanned surface vessels. He says a major Ukrainian USV gaining household recognition is the Magura V5. This tiny craft, barely 18 feet long, has been responsible for sinking several Russian warships, but the V5 did not appear until 2023. Before that, there were 4 earlier designs. And one interesting piece here is the V doesn't stand for version, although it does kind of work out that way. It's because of the V-shaped hull. Happy coincidence, I guess. So it says that in summer of 2022, a Ukrainian team was tasked with, quote, do something with the Russian fleet. And all they really had to start with was a fishing boat, but soon they figured out that they had access to Starlink, could add the Starlink on board. And this was kind of a game changer because it moved what, unmanned surface vessels, drone boats, explosive boats have been a thing. We've seen the Houthis utilize them, the Iranians utilize them, but generally there's a restriction there based off of short-range communications or the ability for enemy to intercept those communications. Starlink meant that they could employ these devices at significant range, manned by a human operator safely, hundreds of kilometers away or more. So the Magura V1, which also version 1, ended up being about 19 feet long. Instead, it was cut down to have an incredibly low profile. They did run through some of the testing here and quickly came out with the V2. And the V2, it looks like, ended up being, again, a little deeper hull, jet ski propulsion, and an onboard motor. Made it even a little more stealthier, harder to identify. In 2022, October of 22, the Magura V3 raced into Sevastopol Harbor in Crimea. The Russian naval base was heavily defended, but the USVs got through, hitting several warships and penetrating deep inside the harbor. Now, not all of the Russian ships that were hit were sunk. Not everything went as planned, but this was kind of the point, October 2022, where Ukraine and the rest of the world was like, oh, that is a formidable weapon system. Now, the main variant right now, known as the V5, followed the experimental V4, and really what that did was it added more fuel and a larger warhead. So right now, it sounds like the people responsible for this say these Magura drones have destroyed at least 17 naval targets and damaged at least 3 more. These are incredibly effective and cost-effective for what it's worth. But the V5 is, while maybe the most well-known version right now, it's not the newest, or it's not the end of innovation, if you will. So the V5 was followed by the larger W6, just to add some confusion, which stands for whaler hull, like Boston whaling ships kind of thing. So it's a wider platform, which was used to then start placing things like multiple launch rocket systems or air defense systems on top of these USVs. The W6 made way for the even larger V7. The V7 is the one that famously a couple months ago shot down a Russian flanker with a Sidewinder missile. So now, in terms of publicly available information, we're at the V7, but the V7 being used to intercept aircraft, W6 being used to engage ground targets and some aircraft, and then V5 right now, it sounds like, is still the kind of base model, loaded full of explosives, drive it into the side of a Russian ship and detonate. But from what I can tell, a lot of that is pretty newly public information just reported by H I Sutton over at Naval News. I'll link his article as well as that full thread by Michael Kofman in the description below if you want to see them in their entirety. But that's all we got for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.